Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
People always ask why the divine masculine runs. Like it's some calculated thing. Like he wakes up one morning and decides to destroy something good. But honestly, most of the time, it doesn't even look like running at first. It looks like hesitation, like replying slower, like suddenly becoming tired all the time, like staring at a text for 20 minutes and still saying, "I'll answer later." It looks like a man holding someone he deeply wants, while quietly panicking inside his own body. And the strangest part is, sometimes he leaves right after the moment he feels the most connected. Not because he feels nothing, because he feels too much. And nobody really talks about how embarrassing that is. How a grown man can miss someone so badly and still avoid opening her message. How he can replay one tiny moment for months. The way she looked at him in the car, the silence after she laughed, that one sentence she said casually that somehow cracked something open inside him, and still disappear. Not because he's evil, not because he's spiritually unevolved, not even because he wants someone else. Sometimes he runs because being loved that deeply starts exposing things he spent years trying not to feel. And once that starts happening, he doesn't always know how to stay. Nobody notices the beginning of it. That's the strange part. People imagine running as something dramatic, a slam door, a breakup speech, somebody pulling away overnight like they suddenly stop caring. But real emotional withdrawal usually starts quietly, almost invisibly. A delayed text, a slightly different tone, a man saying work's been crazy lately and maybe even believing it himself. And if I'm being honest, sometimes he doesn't realize he's pulling away until he's already halfway emotionally gone. That's what makes this so confusing for both people. Because in the beginning, he still sounds interested. He still watches her stories. Still asks if she got home safe. Still sends random reels at 1 a.m. because something reminded him of her laugh. But something underneath starts changing. His body knows before his mind does. That sounds dramatic, but I don't know how else to explain it. It's like his nervous system starts treating intimacy like danger before his thoughts can organize a proper explanation. And suddenly tiny things start feeling heavier than they should. A simple "I miss you" text sits unanswered for 2 hours because he reads it and feels warmth, then pressure, then confusion, then guilt for not answering immediately. So he tells himself, "I'll respond when I can think clearly." But then the delay becomes awkward. Then shame enters. Then avoidance. And now, somehow, a loving text feels emotionally loaded. Which sounds ridiculous. Even to him. Especially to him. That's why a lot of men in this dynamic start acting strangely casual right when feelings become real. He'll joke more. Deflect more, become harder to read, not because he feels less, usually because he feels more than he knows how to hold. I remember this one night specifically. He had just dropped her off after spending almost the entire weekend together. Nothing huge happened, no dramatic conversation, no declaration of love. Honestly, the night was painfully ordinary. They got takeout. Half-watched a movie. She fell asleep on the couch for 20 minutes with her head against his shoulder while some stupid cooking show played in the background. At one point, she woke up slightly confused and asked, "Did I miss the ending?" And he laughed quietly and said, "You missed the entire plot." That was it. That was the moment. Not because it was magical, because it felt normal. Comfortable in a way that scared him more than intensity ever did. Later that night, driving home alone, he kept replaying that tiny moment for no reason he could explain. the sound of her sleepy voice, the warmth still sitting in his chest, the terrifying realization that he was starting to emotionally attach himself to someone who could actually hurt him. And that's when the shift usually begins. Not after conflict, after softness. People rarely talk about that. Men are expected to fear commitment when things get serious externally. But sometimes what actually scares him is internal closeness. The moment someone starts feeling emotionally familiar, the moment her presence starts affecting his internal state, the moment he catches himself wanting to tell her random things throughout the day, like seeing her favorite drink at a gas station and almost taking a picture before stopping himself. That tiny hesitation matters more than people realize, because there's usually a thought attached to it. Something like, how? Why do I care this much? And if he already has unresolved emotional avoidance, that question alone can trigger distance, not because he consciously wants to leave, more because his system starts trying to regain control. That's why early withdrawal often looks so confusing. One day he's emotionally open, the next day he seems distracted, then warm again, then distant again. It creates emotional whiplash because even he doesn't fully understand what's happening internally. Part of him genuinely wants closeness. Another part starts associating closeness with emotional exposure. And exposure feels dangerous, especially for men who learned very early that vulnerability comes with humiliation, rejection, pressure, or loss of control. So instead of saying, "This connection is scaring me emotionally," he says, "I just need some space," because that sounds more manageable, more masculine, less embarrassing. But space rarely fixes the actual issue, because the distance doesn't remove the feelings. Usually, it just removes the person while the feelings keep following him round anyway. That's the part nobody sees. The silent aftermath, the weird behaviors, the emotional confusion that looks immature from the outside, because honestly sometimes it is immature. Like opening her chat, typing something, deleting it, locking the phone, then checking if she viewed his story 15 minutes later. Or suddenly becoming hyper-focused on work after intimacy. Cleaning the apartment at midnight because emotional vulnerability created physical restlessness in his body. Going emotionally cold for 3 days. Then sending a random meme like nothing happened. And the worst part is, sometimes he hates himself while doing it. Not in a dramatic self-pity way. Just this quiet awareness of, why am I acting like this? But awareness alone doesn't automatically create emotional capacity. That's another thing people misunderstand. A man can know he's avoiding and still avoid. A man can miss her terribly and still not reach out. A man can feel emotionally safe with someone and simultaneously feel trapped by how much he needs that safety. Human beings are contradictory like that, especially emotionally overwhelmed ones. I think people want clean explanations because uncertainty hurts. He ran because he didn't care. He ran because he was scared. He ran because she was too good for him. Reality is usually messier. Sometimes he cared deeply and still handled it badly. Sometimes he genuinely intended to stay, then panicked when emotional intimacy became consistent instead of temporary. Because casual closeness is easy for some men, consistent emotional presence is harder, especially when someone starts seeing through them. Not the polished version, not the charming version, the tired version, the insecure version, the emotionally inconsistent version. That level of visibility changes things. And oddly enough, being deeply seen can feel less emotionally comfortable than being desired. Desire feels controllable. Being emotionally known does not. There's also this moment That happens sometimes after deep connection, where he suddenly becomes quieter. You can literally feel the energy change. She thinks, "Did I do something wrong?" And internally, he's thinking something completely different. Usually not even in clear sentences. More like sensations. Pressure in the chest. Restlessness. The urge to retreat. Mental static. His body wants distance before his mind can explain why. Then later he creates intellectual reasons to justify the feeling. "I've just been stressed. I don't think I'm ready. I need to focus on myself." And maybe some of that is true. But underneath those explanations is often something much less polished. "This started feeling emotionally real, and I don't know how to stay regulated inside the reality." That's the sentence most people never hear. Because men are rarely taught how to articulate emotional overwhelm without feeling weak. So instead they disappear into distractions. Work, gym, gaming, scrolling, friends, silence, anything that reduces the intensity temporarily. But avoidance has a strange side effect. The more distance he creates physically, the louder the emotional experience often becomes internally. Now she's everywhere, in tiny things. A song he didn't care about before, a parking lot, a hoodie left on the chair for 3 days because moving it feels weirdly final. And still, he might not reach out, because now shame gets involved too. Too much time passed. The silence became noticeable. He doesn't know how to explain himself without sounding emotionally ridiculous. So he waits longer, which makes it worse. And underneath all of this is a truth that feels almost embarrassingly human. Sometimes he runs because he actually wanted it to matter less than it did. Because once someone reaches him emotionally, he loses the illusion of being unaffected. And some men are far more comfortable chasing connection than receiving it. Receiving it changes them, exposes them, makes them aware of needs they were functioning just fine pretending they didn't have, until suddenly they do. And now, he's sitting in his car at night replaying one harmless moment over and over again, trying to understand why something so soft felt so emotionally dangerous. It usually happens in a moment that looks completely forgettable from the outside. That's what makes it so hard to explain later. People think emotional turning points are dramatic. A confession, a kiss in the rain, some cinematic realization where music practically starts playing in the background. But honestly, for a lot of men, the moment she becomes emotionally real is painfully small, almost stupidly ordinary. And because it looks so normal, he doesn't even realize at first that something irreversible just happened inside him. Sometimes it's a sentence, not even a deep one, just timed wrong. All right, like her casually saying, "You don't have to pretend you're okay all the time around me." And suddenly he goes quiet. Not because he's offended, because something in him reacted before he could control it. Now externally, maybe nothing changes. He shrugs, makes a joke, changes the subject, takes a sip of his drink like the sentence didn't land anywhere important. But internally, it sits there, for days sometimes, because most emotionally avoidant men are used to being perceived in fragments. Useful, funny, desired, reliable, distracting, but not fully felt, not fully read. So when someone notices something emotionally true underneath the performance, there's usually a split second of warmth followed almost immediately by panic. And the panic is rarely logical. That's the frustrating part. Because if you asked him directly, "Do you like her?" the answer would probably be yes. If you asked, "Do you feel safe with her?" also yes. But if you asked, "Then why are you pulling away?" That's where everything gets blurry. Because emotional closeness and emotional safety are not always the same thing to the nervous system. Sometimes closeness itself becomes the threat, especially if he's spent years surviving by staying emotionally self-contained. There was this one memory I can't stop thinking about. They were sitting in traffic after dinner. Nothing emotional was even happening. She was talking about something random, her childhood maybe, or some story about getting lost with her cousin at a mall when she was little. And he wasn't even fully listening at first. He was tired, half focused on the road, mentally somewhere else. Then she laughed. Not loudly, not performatively, just this small, unguarded laugh that slipped out before she covered her mouth for a second like she was embarrassed by how genuine it was. And something about that moment completely disarmed him. Not because she looked perfect, because she looked real, human, comfortable, safe enough to stop performing for a second. And his chest physically tightened. That's the part people don't understand. The body reacts first, before the thoughts, before the labels, before the spiritual explanations people like attaching afterward. Sometimes the body knows this person is getting past your defenses, and depending on his emotional history, that realization can create connection and fear simultaneously. So later that night, he did what a lot of men do when they're overwhelmed emotionally. He became quieter, not intentionally manipulative, not strategically distant, just internally flooded. He drove home in silence instead of turning music on, checked his phone twice even though no new messages came in, opened her Instagram story, closed it halfway through, then reopened it 30 seconds later. Like his body wanted contact while another part wanted emotional distance. That contradiction becomes exhausting after a while, because he starts feeling emotionally affected in ways he can't easily organize. He misses her too quickly, thinks about her during stupid moments, feels disappointed when she takes longer to respond even while pretending he doesn't care. And honestly, that loss of emotional control embarrasses him a little, especially if he built his identity around being independent or emotionally composed. That's why some men start subtly pulling away right after the connection deepens. Not before intimacy. After. People often misunderstand that timing. They think, if he cared, closeness would make him stay. But closeness is exactly what activates the fear sometimes. Because now there's something to lose. Now her mood affects his mood. Now, one distant text from her can quietly ruin his entire evening, even while he continues acting normal around everyone else. And men are rarely taught how to process that kind of emotional dependency without feeling weak. So, instead, they try to regain emotional control. Not always consciously. Sometimes through tiny behavioral shifts. Replying slower, acting more casual, suddenly emphasizing how busy they are, creating emotional ambiguity where there wasn't any before. And the sad thing is, half the time he thinks he's protecting himself. The other half, he's trying not to scare her with how much he actually feels. Because emotional intensity can make avoidant men deeply self-conscious, especially when the feelings don't match the image they have of themselves. There's this weird phase where he starts monitoring himself around her, catching himself before saying too much, wanting to text her random thoughts during the day, then stopping halfway through typing because suddenly it feels too vulnerable. He'll stare at a message like, "This made me think of you." Delete it. Rewrite. "Lol, this is funny." Send that instead. It sounds small, but emotionally it's huge, because that tiny edit reveals the entire internal conflict. He wants connection, but he wants emotional protection too. And eventually those two desires start fighting each other. That's when the energy changes. She feels it immediately usually. Women are often incredibly perceptive emotionally in these dynamics. Not because they're crazy, not because they're overanalyzing, because the shift is real. His warmth becomes inconsistent. His attention flickers. His presence feels partially there. And if she asks what's wrong, he often genuinely doesn't know how to explain it. What is he supposed to say? You started mattering to me and now my entire nervous system is acting weird. Most men would rather die than phrase it like that. So instead he says things that are technically true, but emotionally incomplete. I've just had a lot on my mind. I'm trying to figure some things out. I don't know what I want right now. And sometimes he believes those explanations. Partially. But underneath all of them is usually a much more uncomfortable reality. He felt himself getting emotionally attached, and it scared him how quickly it happened. There's also grief hidden inside this stage that almost nobody talks about. Because once she becomes emotionally real, he unconsciously understands something else too. If this continues, she could hurt him. Not intentionally, just by becoming important. That possibility alone changes everything, especially for men who associate attachment with eventual loss, rejection, pressure, or emotional helplessness. So now every good moment starts carrying emotional risk underneath it. And weirdly, that risk can make him less emotionally expressive externally even while feeling more internally. That contradiction confuses everyone involved, including him. There's this late-night internal dialogue that starts happening eventually, usually when he's alone, driving, showering, lying in bed staring at the ceiling while pretending to watch something. She matters too much. Okay, and that's bad. Why? I don't know. But he does know. Just not intellectually. His body knows. His history knows. The younger version of him that learned closeness could become pain knows. So now even tenderness starts feeling emotionally loaded. A soft look lingers too long in his mind. A goodbye hug affects him for hours afterward. Her absence suddenly feels physical. And instead of moving closer to those feelings, sometimes he starts resisting them. That's the tragic part. Not because he doesn't care, because he cares enough to become afraid. People always simplify masculine withdrawal into cruelty or disinterest. And sometimes, yes, men absolutely avoid responsibility and emotionally mishandle people. But sometimes a man goes distant because something inside him quietly realized, oh no, this is becoming real. This is the part people struggle to understand because it sounds emotionally dishonest. How can someone want closeness and escape from it at the exact same time? How can a man miss her desperately while actively creating distance? But if you've ever lived through this dynamic, not theorized about it, not romanticized it, actually lived it, you know how real this contradiction is. Because sometimes the same person who feels safest to him also becomes the person who emotionally overwhelms him the most. And he hates that about himself. That's important. A lot of this isn't happening from a place of confidence. It's happening from confusion, from emotional self-protection, from panic mixed with attachment, which creates behavior that feels incredibly painful on the receiving end because it's so inconsistent. One night he's deeply present, soft, open, looking at her in that quiet way men do when they accidentally stop guarding themselves for a minute. Then 2 days later he feels emotionally unreachable. Short replies, flat tone, suddenly busy, suddenly tired, suddenly needing time to think. And the shift feels so abrupt that it makes her question her own reality. But internally, The shift usually started long before the behavior changed. Because after emotional intimacy, something strange starts happening inside him. The connection lingers. That's the problem. He leaves her place, gets in the car, and instead of feeling relaxed, he feels emotionally exposed. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's subtle. He notices he's driving slower than usual, sitting in silence instead of turning music on, replaying tiny moments she probably forgot 5 minutes after they happened. The way she touched his arm while laughing. The way she looked at him when he got quiet for a second. That small pause before she said goodbye. And instead of simply enjoying the closeness, his brain starts trying to regulate the intensity of it. That's when emotional distancing often begins. Not because the intimacy meant nothing, because it meant too much. I remember hearing someone describe it once in the most painfully accurate way. It felt good while I was with her. It felt terrifying after. That sentence stayed with me because it explains something most people miss. Some men can access vulnerability in the moment, but sustaining emotional openness afterward is much harder. Because once he's alone again, the feelings echo louder. Now there's no distraction. No physical closeness softening the fear. No eye contact calming his nervous system. Just him, his thoughts, and the realization that someone is starting to matter in a way he can't easily control anymore. And control matters more to emotionally avoidant men than they usually admit. Not controlling her, controlling themselves. Controlling how affected they are, how attached they become, how much emotional power another person has over their internal state. That's why some men become colder immediately after intimacy. Not only physical intimacy, emotional intimacy too. Especially emotional intimacy. A deep conversation. A vulnerable moment. Falling asleep together. Being emotionally seen. Those moments crack something open. And afterward, he sometimes reacts the way people react after overstimulation. Withdrawal, silence, distance, numbness, almost like his system is trying to emotionally cool itself down. The tragic part is, she usually experiences the withdrawal as rejection, while internally he may actually be thinking about her constantly. That contradiction destroys people emotionally because the external behavior and the internal experience don't match at all. He misses her, while ignoring her message. He wants to hear her voice, while avoiding the call. He checks her profile, while pretending he needs space. And yes, sometimes this behavior is immature, painfully immature. Because emotional confusion does not erase emotional responsibility. That matters too. But underneath the avoidance is often a very human fear. If I let myself fully feel this, what happens to me if I lose it? That fear changes people. Quietly. Especially people who already learned somewhere earlier in life that attachment can become pain unexpectedly. So, instead of moving toward the connection naturally, they start managing it, reducing it, containing it, creating distance before dependency fully forms. Not always consciously. Sometimes his body starts doing it automatically. He'll wake up wanting to text her, then suddenly feel irritated for no reason. Not irritated at her exactly, irritated at the vulnerability itself. At how emotionally affected he's becoming. That irritation confuses him too, because logically he knows she's not doing anything wrong, which creates another layer of shame. Now he feels emotionally needy and emotionally avoidant simultaneously, and that combination creates bizarre behavior, like staring at her message notification without opening it because he wants the comfort of knowing she reached out, without yet facing the emotional intensity of responding. or purposely taking longer to answer because immediate enthusiasm suddenly feels too revealing, or becoming unusually focused on productivity after closeness, cleaning, working out, answering emails at midnight, anything to move emotional energy somewhere manageable. There's also this deeply uncomfortable thing that happens when a man starts emotionally attaching to someone who genuinely sees him. He begins losing access to the emotionally detached version of himself, the version that felt safe because nothing could really reach him. And part of him resents that loss, not because he wants to hurt her, because emotional armor becomes addictive after years of wearing it. Distance feels familiar, control feels safe, neediness feels dangerous. So even while craving intimacy, he may unconsciously resent the fact that he needs it now. That resentment can leak out in strange ways, becoming emotionally inconsistent, pulling away after beautiful moments, creating arguments over small things, acting emotionally unavailable right when she starts relaxing into the connection. Sometimes he doesn't even realize he's sabotaging things. Other times, he knows exactly what he's doing while doing it anyway. That's the hard truth. Self-awareness does not automatically stop avoidance. People think once someone realizes their patterns, everything changes. No. Sometimes awareness just makes the guilt louder. Now he notices himself withdrawing in real time, not texting back, becoming emotionally flat, creating unnecessary distance. And there's this awful internal dialogue happening underneath it all. Just answer her. I will later. You said that 3 hours ago. I know. Then why are you avoiding this? Because if I answer normally, this becomes real again. That's the part he rarely says out loud. Contact reactivates the emotional reality. And sometimes he's trying desperately to calm himself down emotionally before stepping back into the connection. But the longer he waits, the heavier it becomes. Now there's pressure. Now she notices the distance. Now shame enters the dynamic. Now even sending a simple message feels emotionally loaded. So he delays more, which hurts her more, which makes him feel worse, which creates even more avoidance. It becomes a loop. And the saddest part is, sometimes while she's crying, confused why he disappeared emotionally, he's lying awake at 2 a.m. rereading old conversations, missing her, thinking about reaching out, feeling relief from the distance and grief because of it at the same time. That emotional duality is exhausting. Wanting closeness, wanting escape, wanting reassurance, wanting freedom from needing reassurance. And because men are often socialized to suppress emotional dependency instead of understanding it, many of them experience attachment as weakness instead of connection. So they fight the feeling instead of communicating it. That's why he may suddenly become emotionally hard to read after moments of tenderness. Not because tenderness meant nothing, because tenderness affected him deeply, more deeply than he wanted. There's one detail people almost never talk about: the physical exhaustion that sometimes follows emotional vulnerability. After deep emotional intimacy, some men genuinely feel drained. Not peaceful, drained. Like their nervous system ran a marathon trying to stay emotionally open. So now they go quiet. Not always because they're losing feelings. Sometimes because they're overwhelmed by the amount of feelings they already have. But unfortunately, from the outside, silence and disinterest can look identical. And that's where so much heartbreak begins. Because she experiences abandonment, while internally he may be experiencing emotional flooding he doesn't know how to regulate. Neither person fully understands the other. And somewhere in the middle of all that confusion is a man sitting alone in the dark with his phone in his hand, missing her intensely, while still convincing himself not to call. At some point, avoidance stops looking accidental. That's when things become painful. In the beginning, the distance feels subtle enough to explain away. He's stressed, busy, tired, distracted, and honestly, sometimes those things are true. But eventually there comes a moment where the silence starts feeling intentional. Not necessarily cruel, just chosen. And that's usually the moment she begins emotionally unraveling. Because human beings can survive confusion longer than they can survive inconsistency. Confusion still leaves room for hope. Inconsistency slowly destroys emotional safety. One day he's warm. The next day he disappears emotionally for 12 hours. Then comes back acting normal. Then distant again. And what makes it worse is that he often doesn't fully understand why he's doing it either. That's the maddening part. People imagine avoidant behavior as calculated. Like he's sitting there strategically deciding, how do I create emotional chaos today? No. Most of the time, it's much less sophisticated than that. It's a man feeling emotionally overwhelmed, trying to reduce internal pressure, without realizing his coping mechanisms are slowly hurting someone else. And silence becomes the easiest tool, because silence delays vulnerability. Silence delays accountability. Silence delays the terrifying possibility of saying something emotionally honest, and then having to live inside the consequences of it. That's why some men start choosing silence even when they miss her intensely. Because missing someone privately feels emotionally safer than being emotionally visible to them directly. Which sounds insane when you say it out loud. But emotionally, it makes sense to people who learn vulnerability through fear instead of safety. There's this specific moment that happens sometimes after a deep emotional connection. She sends a thoughtful message, not demanding, not dramatic, just emotionally open. Maybe something simple like, I feel like you've been distant lately. And the second he reads it, his stomach drops. Not because he wants to lose her, because now the emotional reality can no longer stay hidden under casual interaction. Now there's emotional responsibility in the room. Now he has to either move closer emotionally or admit he's pulling away. And both options feel terrifying. So instead, he waits. At first he tells himself it's temporary. I just need time to think. But the longer he waits, the heavier the message becomes. Now 30 minutes pass, then 2 hours, then the entire evening. And the whole time he's thinking about it. That's the part people rarely understand. Avoidant silence is often mentally loud. He rereads the message multiple times, starts typing responses, deletes them, imagines how she'll react to every possible answer. This isn't fair to her. I know. So answer, I don't know what to say. Then tell the truth. I don't even fully understand the truth myself. That internal paralysis becomes exhausting. Because deep down he usually knows she can feel the distance already. Women almost always feel it before men verbally admit it. The change in tone, the missing warmth, the emotional hesitation. And once he realizes she notices, shame enters the dynamic. Now it's not just avoidance anymore. Now he feels guilty too. Guilty for withdrawing. Guilty for confusing her. Guilty for wanting closeness while simultaneously resisting it. And shame makes people hide even more, especially men who already struggle expressing emotional vulnerability. That's why sometimes the silence gets worse right after emotional confrontation. Not because he doesn't care, because now he feels exposed. There's this misconception that emotionally avoidant men feel nothing during separation or silence. Honestly, sometimes silence tortures him too. just differently. She experiences abandonment externally. He experiences emotional pressure internally. Neither one knows how to bridge the gap safely anymore. And instead of admitting, "I'm overwhelmed and emotionally scared," he starts saying emotionally incomplete things. "I just need space. I've been in my head lately. I don't know what's wrong with me." And maybe part of him genuinely doesn't know, because emotional avoidance often happens faster than conscious understanding. The body retreats first. The explanations come afterward. That's why his behavior can feel so contradictory. He ignores her message, but watches her story immediately, disappears emotionally for days, then suddenly sends something random at midnight, acts detached, while secretly hoping she still cares enough to respond warmly. It creates emotional whiplash because part of him wants reassurance while another part resists closeness. And sometimes he hates himself for it. Quietly, not in a dramatic movie scene kind of way. More like standing in the kitchen at 1 a.m. staring into the refrigerator without even being hungry, knowing he's hurting someone, and still feeling unable to emotionally move correctly. That helplessness is real. Immature sometimes, selfish sometimes, but real. There's also this deeply human thing that happens when avoidance stretches too long. The silence itself starts becoming emotionally impossible to break. The longer he disappears, the more emotionally loaded reconnecting becomes. Now a simple, "Hey," feels inadequate. Now there's accumulated tension sitting underneath every interaction. Now he imagines her anger, her disappointment, her sadness. So he delays even more, which deepens the shame, which deepens the avoidance. It becomes a loop that feeds itself, and externally it can look cold, but internally it's often panic mixed with emotional exhaustion, especially at night. Nighttime is usually when the emotional defenses weaken. During the day, he can distract himself. Work, friends, gym, noise. But late at night, everything gets quieter, and suddenly the feelings he spent all day suppressing start surfacing again. That's when he checks the conversation thread, scrolls upward, rereads old messages, stops at certain voice notes longer than he should. Sometimes he even starts typing long, honest paragraphs, things he would never actually send. "I miss you. I don't know why I'm acting like this. You didn't do anything wrong. This got too real for me. Delete, delete, delete." Then instead he sends nothing at all, which somehow feels easier emotionally than being fully seen. That's the tragedy of avoidance. Silence creates temporary relief, but long-term suffering, because the emotions don't disappear during silence. They usually grow in private, especially once he realizes her absence actually affects him. That realization can be deeply destabilizing for emotionally guarded men, because now he's emotionally attached while simultaneously behaving disconnected. And living in contradiction drains people. You can feel it physically after a while. Trouble sleeping, restlessness, random irritation, emotional numbness followed by emotional flooding. One moment he feels nothing. The next moment something tiny reminds him of her, and suddenly his chest tightens unexpectedly. A song, a restaurant, the smell of her perfume lingering on a hoodie he still hasn't washed. And then comes the strangest emotional experience of all. Relief and grief existing together. Relief from the pressure of closeness. Grief because he misses the closeness anyway. That emotional split confuses him deeply, because now even his own feelings feel unreliable. Part of him thinks, maybe I should just let this go. Another part quietly whispers, then why does losing her feel unbearable? But instead of staying inside that question honestly, many men retreat further into silence. Because silence creates the illusion of control. If he doesn't answer, he doesn't have to fully confront the emotional reality yet. If he delays long enough, maybe the feelings will calm down. Except they usually don't. They just become lonelier. There's one detail people rarely talk about. Avoidant men often imagine reconnecting constantly while actively avoiding reconnecting in real life. They rehearse conversations internally. Imagine apologizing. Imagine seeing her again. Imagine explaining themselves properly this time. But imagination feels emotionally safer than actual vulnerability. Because imagination cannot reject you. Real people can. And underneath all the silence, all the delayed messages, all the emotional distance, is usually a man trying to avoid one unbearable feeling: emotional helplessness. Because once someone truly matters, you lose the ability to remain untouched by them. And for some men, that loss of emotional control feels more frightening than loneliness itself. I think this is the part people misunderstand the most. Because we keep trying to explain emotional avoidance like it's purely intellectual. Like if someone loves you enough, they'll naturally relax into closeness. Communicate clearly. Stay emotionally consistent. But human beings are not that clean. Especially not emotionally wounded human beings. Sometimes a man can love someone deeply and still experience the connection like his nervous system is under attack. Not because the love is bad, because intimacy starts activating things his body associates with danger: old fear, loss of control, emotional dependency, exposure, abandonment, and the body doesn't care that the current person is safe. That's what makes this dynamic so tragic. His mind may know she's good for him. His body still reacts like something dangerous is happening, which creates behaviors that look irrational from the outside. Because honestly, they are irrational. There's this physical restlessness that starts happening when emotional attachment deepens. Not romantic restlessness, not butterflies, more like agitation mixed with longing. Like his system can't decide whether to move closer or run. And people rarely talk about how physical emotional avoidance actually feels. The tight chest, the sudden exhaustion after vulnerability, the overstimulation after deep conversation, the urge to isolate after emotional closeness. Sometimes he leaves a meaningful interaction and immediately feels like he needs silence. Not because he didn't enjoy it, because internally he feels flooded. Like his body absorbed too much emotional intensity at once. I remember someone describing it once like this: "She made me feel calm while I was with her, then anxious the second I was alone again." That sentence explains more than most psychological theories, honestly. Because emotional safety and emotional activation can coexist at the same time. That's why some men become incredibly confusing after intimacy. The connection genuinely affects them, but instead of settling their nervous system, sometimes it exposes how dysregulated they already are underneath everything. And now, ordinary life starts feeling strange. He can't focus the same. Sleep becomes inconsistent. He starts checking his phone compulsively without realizing it. Not even necessarily for her message specifically, just checking. Like his body is waiting for emotional impact. That anticipation becomes addictive and exhausting at the same time. And when emotional overwhelm builds up, he starts coping physically instead of emotionally. That's important. A lot of avoidant behavior isn't verbally expressed because it's happening somatically first. So instead of saying, "I'm emotionally overwhelmed," his body says, "Clean the apartment, go to the gym, drive around for an hour, scroll mindlessly, work more, stay busy, anything that converts emotional energy into motion. There's this very specific masculine behavior that happens sometimes after emotional intimacy. He suddenly becomes hyperproductive, almost aggressively functional, answering emails at midnight, reorganizing drawers that don't need reorganizing, fixing random things around the house. And from the outside, it just looks like normal life. But internally, he's trying to regulate emotional intensity through activity because stillness makes him feel everything too loudly. Stillness is dangerous once someone emotionally matters to him. Silence becomes loud. That's when the memories start replaying. Tiny ones. Always tiny ones. Not the dramatic moments. The microscopic human details. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear while listening. The sleepy tone in her voice during late-night calls. The exact expression she made when he accidentally opened up emotionally for half a second. His mind loops those moments repeatedly because emotionally meaningful experiences get stored differently in the body. And the more emotionally affected he becomes, the more he may start externally withdrawing, which sounds backwards. But avoidance often works backwards. He misses her more, so he contacts her less. He feels emotionally dependent, so he acts emotionally detached. He wants reassurance, so he avoids situations where he might need reassurance openly. That contradiction starts exhausting him physically too. People underestimate how draining emotional suppression becomes over time, especially for men raised to intellectualize feelings instead of processing them. So now his nervous system is carrying emotions his conscious mind keeps trying to minimize. And eventually the body starts leaking the truth anyway. Irritability, emotional numbness, random sadness, difficulty concentrating, insomnia, restlessness, mental fog. Sometimes he doesn't even realize the connection is affecting him this deeply until she pulls away slightly. Then suddenly his whole system reacts. Now he can't eat normally, can't focus, feels emotionally panic over tiny changes in her energy. And instead of admitting, "I'm scared of losing you," he becomes quieter, or colder, or weirdly defensive, because vulnerability feels more threatening than distance, even when distance hurts more. There's also this embarrassing human detail nobody talks about enough. Sometimes emotionally avoidant men physically check their phones before they consciously realize they were hoping for her message. It becomes automatic. Wake up, check phone, pretend not to care, put phone down, pick it back up 3 minutes later. And if her name appears, there's this immediate emotional reaction in the body. Relief, warmth, anxiety, pressure, all at once. Which is why even positive connection can become emotionally overstimulating. That's the part people don't understand. It's not always rejection. Sometimes it's emotional overload. And overload creates strange behavior, like hearing her voice and suddenly needing alone time afterward, or having an amazing weekend together, then emotionally disappearing for 2 days to recover internally, which hurts her deeply because she experiences the withdrawal as punishment or loss of interest. Meanwhile, internally, he may be lying in bed staring at the ceiling replaying the entire weekend obsessively, missing her, resenting how much he misses her, feeling comforted by her presence, feeling trapped by his emotional dependence on that comfort. Human beings are messy, especially when love starts reaching parts of them they build entire identities around protecting. There's one scene that feels painfully real to me. He's driving at night after seeing her, one hand on the steering wheel, no music playing, phone lighting up briefly beside him. He already knows it's probably her, and instead of checking immediately, He waits. Not because he doesn't want to. Because he does want to. Too much. That's the problem. He can feel how emotionally affected he is becoming in real time. So he waits at a red light, takes a breath first, then opens the message carefully like he's emotionally bracing for impact. And the message is something completely normal. Did you get home safe? That's it. Simple, caring, soft. But his chest tightens anyway. Because now someone exists whose emotional presence genuinely regulates him. And dependence, even healthy emotional dependence, terrifies people who survived by relying only on themselves emotionally. So what does he do with that fear? Usually not the healthiest thing. He suppresses, distances, distracts, and eventually the nervous system starts confusing emotional intimacy with emotional danger entirely. That's when he says things like, "I don't know why I feel like this." And honestly, sometimes he truly doesn't, because his conscious thoughts are arriving late to emotional reactions that already happened in the body. The body pulled away first. The explanations formed afterward. That's why his reasons often sound vague or incomplete. I just feel overwhelmed. I need space. I've been stressed. And underneath those sentences is usually a nervous system struggling to regulate closeness without shutting down from it. There's also grief hidden inside this experience, because part of him knows he's ruining something meaningful while it's happening. That awareness hurts. He notices himself becoming inconsistent, harder to reach, emotionally strange. He notices her confusion too, the slight sadness in her tone, the hesitation in her messages, the way she starts protecting herself emotionally, and instead of moving toward her honestly, sometimes shame pushes him even further away, because now he's not only emotionally overwhelmed, now he feels guilty too, which creates even more nervous system pressure, more avoidance, more emotional paralysis, more silence, until eventually he's sitting alone in a dark room at 1:37 in the morning scrolling through old photos, feeling emotionally consumed by someone he keeps pretending he needs distance from. And maybe the saddest part is this. He often believes the problem is the connection, when really, the connection is exposing emotional wounds his nervous system was already carrying long before she arrived. This is where the guilt starts becoming harder to ignore, because eventually even he notices the change in himself. Not all at once, just in flashes. Small moments where he catches himself acting emotionally strange and thinks, "What am I doing?" And honestly, that realization can be terrifying too, because up until this point, part of him still believed he was handling it, managing the feelings, controlling the attachment, keeping enough distance to stay emotionally safe. But now the behavior is getting harder to justify. Now he's hurting someone he genuinely cares about. Now he's becoming inconsistent in ways that even confuse him. And the worst part, some of the behavior starts looking immature even to himself. Not evil, not malicious, just emotionally messy in a way that feels embarrassing for a grown man. Like intentionally taking longer to reply because answering too fast suddenly feels emotionally exposing. Opening her message instantly, then waiting 2 hours before responding so he doesn't look too affected. As if pretending not to care somehow gives him emotional control back. Which is ridiculous. He knows it's ridiculous. But emotional fear makes people do strange things. Especially men who are trying to feel less vulnerable without admitting vulnerability exists in the first place. That's when the contradictions become impossible to hide. He misses her constantly, but starts acting detached during conversations. He wants reassurance, but becomes emotionally unavailable when she tries getting closer. He craves emotional safety, then sabotages it the second it starts feeling stable. And sometimes he watches himself doing it in real time. That's the painful part. Awareness arrives, but not fast enough to stop the reaction. There's this specific kind of silence that happens after emotional intimacy. Not peaceful silence, heavy silence. Like his whole nervous system suddenly became overstimulated by closeness. So now, instead of relaxing into the connection, he starts pulling energy away from it. Less affectionate, less expressive, slightly colder. And she notices immediately. Of course she does. Women can usually feel emotional withdrawal before a single word gets said, especially when the connection used to feel warm and emotionally alive. Now, his responses feel flatter. His attention drifts during conversations. He starts sounding emotionally elsewhere. And when she asks if something's wrong, he often gets defensive. Not because she's wrong, because she's right. That's what makes him defensive. There's this unbearable discomfort that happens when someone accurately notices the emotional shift you're trying to hide from yourself. So instead of admitting, "Yeah, I think I'm overwhelmed by how much this affects me," he says, "You're overthinking. I've just been busy. Nothing's wrong," even while internally everything feels wrong. That emotional dishonesty creates another problem. Now he's disconnected not only from her, but from himself too, because he's constantly suppressing reactions he doesn't fully understand. There's a moment that happens sometimes late at night where the emotional mask slips for a second, usually when nobody's around. He's sitting alone scrolling through old messages, or replaying voice notes, or staring at a picture of her longer than he means to. And suddenly the truth hits him clearly. Oh my God, I actually care. Not casually, not temporarily, deeply. And instead of relief, sometimes the realization creates panic. Because now the emotional stakes feel real. Now losing her would hurt. Now disappointing her hurts. Now watching her slowly pull away because of his inconsistency hurts too. That's when shame starts entering the picture heavily. Not performative shame, private shame. The kind nobody sees. Like sitting in your car after ignoring someone all day, finally opening their message, and realizing the tone changed. More distant now, more careful, and feeling this awful sinking sensation because you know you caused that shift. But instead of immediately fixing it, he freezes. Because shame doesn't always create accountability. Sometimes it creates paralysis, especially in emotionally avoidant people. Now every interaction feels emotionally loaded. He overthinks simple messages, reads emotional meaning into punctuation, starts worrying she's angry while simultaneously avoiding the conversation that could clear everything up. And internally there's this exhausting argument happening constantly. Just talk to her honestly. I will. Then why are you avoiding it? Because I don't even know how to explain myself anymore. Try. What if the explanation makes me sound emotionally insane? That fear is real. Because from the outside, his behavior often makes no logical sense. Why push away someone you miss constantly? Why create distance from someone who feels emotionally safe? Why become colder after intimacy instead of closer? And honestly, sometimes he doesn't know. That uncertainty makes him feel emotionally unreliable even to himself. So now he starts overcompensating in weird ways. Trying to act normal. Trying to sound unaffected. Trying to regain the emotionally detached version of himself he had before the connection deepened. But once someone reaches you emotionally, you can't fully go back to emotional neutrality. That's what scares him. Because now even ordinary things affect him differently. Music sounds different. Silence feels heavier. Random moments trigger memories unexpectedly. He walks past something that reminds him of her and his whole mood shifts instantly. And instead of leaning into that emotional reality, sometimes he starts acting emotionally numb on purpose. Almost like he's trying to starve the feelings out of himself. That can look incredibly hurtful externally. Detached replies. Avoiding emotional conversations. Acting weirdly casual after meaningful moments. Sometimes even picking small arguments for no reason. People don't talk enough about how emotionally overwhelmed men sometimes create conflict to reduce intimacy. Conflict feels more familiar than vulnerability. Distance feels more manageable than emotional dependence. So he starts unconsciously destabilizing the connection himself. And the tragic part is, part of him knows he's doing it while it's happening. Not fully consciously, but enough to feel guilty. There's one moment that feels painfully human to me. She sends him something thoughtful, not dramatic, just sincere. Maybe, "I miss how close we used to feel." And he reads it immediately. His chest tightens. His throat feels dry. His first emotional reaction is actually tenderness, followed almost instantly by pressure. Now there's expectation. Now there's emotional accountability. Now he has to either move toward vulnerability or continue disappointing someone he cares about. And instead of responding honestly, he puts the phone face down, gets up, starts cleaning something unnecessary, walks around the apartment aimlessly, anything to escape the emotional intensity for a minute. That's the thing about avoidance people don't understand. Sometimes it looks cold externally while internally the person is emotionally flooded. But emotional flooding does not magically prevent damage. She still feels abandoned, confused, rejected, and somewhere deep down he knows that, which makes him feel worse, which makes him avoid more. It becomes this awful cycle where the shame of hurting her creates even more emotional withdrawal. And eventually he starts becoming someone he genuinely doesn't like very much. Less honest, less emotionally available, less open. Not because love disappeared, because fear started controlling his behavior more than love did. That realization can break a person quietly, especially men who always imagine themselves as emotionally strong. Because now he sees himself doing things he once judged other people for, ignoring messages, creating confusion, pulling away without explanation, acting emotionally inconsistent. And underneath all of it is usually one humiliating truth. He's not emotionally regulating well enough to stay connected honestly. That's it. Not some mystical explanation. Just a human being overwhelmed by attachment and reacting poorly to the vulnerability of it. There's also grief in realizing you're becoming emotionally unsafe for someone you deeply care about. That grief changes the way he looks at himself. Because now the connection isn't just exposing his longing. It's exposing his emotional limitations too. And nothing humbles a man faster than realizing, I might actually lose someone important because I don't know how to stay emotionally present when things become real. That awareness sits heavily, especially at night, especially after silence, especially after moments where he almost reaches out, then stops himself again. And eventually he's left sitting alone with the unbearable contradiction underneath all of it. Part of him wants intimacy more than anything. Another part still experiences intimacy like danger. And until those two parts stop fighting each other, he keeps hurting the very connection he secretly doesn't want to lose. The silence always feels more powerful in the beginning. That's what he tells himself anyway. At first, distance feels like control, Like, if he can just step back far enough emotionally, eventually the feelings will settle down into something manageable, something quieter, less consuming. So he withdraws. Maybe not completely, maybe just enough to breathe again. Less texting, less emotional openness, more space between interactions. And for a moment, there's relief in that. A strange, guilty kind of relief. Because emotional intensity is exhausting when you don't know how to hold it properly. So the silence feels calming at first, until it doesn't. That's when the grief starts. Not dramatic grief. Not cinematic heartbreak where somebody collapses crying on the floor while sad music plays. Honestly, it's worse than that sometimes. Because it's subtle, constant, embarrassingly ordinary. The kind of grief that sneaks into completely random moments and ruins them quietly. Like standing in line for coffee and hearing someone laugh in a way that sounds vaguely like her, and your whole body reacting before your brain catches up. Or reaching for your phone automatically because something funny happened during the day. Then remembering you stopped talking. That realization hits differently every single time. Especially the first few weeks. Because habits don't disappear as fast as pride does. Neither does attachment. That's the problem. He thought distance would make the feelings weaker. But sometimes distance just removes the distraction of her physical presence. Now all he has left is the emotional residue. And it's everywhere. In tiny things. The sweatshirt she wore once. A restaurant he can't drive past normally anymore. A voice note he accidentally replays because his thumb hesitates over deleting the conversation thread completely. That hesitation matters. People pretend emotionally avoidant men move on cleanly. A lot of them don't. A lot of them just suffer privately, quietly, without giving anyone access to it. That's why the outside appearance can be so misleading. He still goes to work, still jokes with friends, still posts normal things online. Meanwhile, internally, he's having entire emotional conversations with someone he hasn't spoken to in weeks. That contradiction becomes real after a while, especially because part of him genuinely believes he chose this distance for a reason. And maybe he did. Maybe the closeness overwhelmed him. Maybe the vulnerability became too intense. Maybe he panicked emotionally and handled it badly. But none of that magically erases attachment. That's the painful misunderstanding. Avoidance can suppress expression. It cannot instantly erase emotional imprint. And once someone becomes emotionally real to him, their absence starts behaving strangely inside his body. He notices it at night first. Most people do. Daytime has distractions. Nighttime removes them. Now it's just him alone with his thoughts again. And thoughts become dangerous when unresolved feelings are involved. That's when he starts checking things he pretends he doesn't care about. Her profile, her last active status, whether she changed her picture, whether she looks happy, especially whether she looks happy. There's something deeply lonely about silently observing someone you miss while pretending to yourself you needed distance from them. And honestly, sometimes he doesn't even understand what he's hoping to feel. Relief, jealousy, proof she still misses him too. Usually it's some messy combination of all three. Human emotions are rarely pure. That's something people forget online. Everything gets reduced into clean narratives. He ran because he didn't care. If he loved her, he would stay. Real men communicate. Maybe. But real human beings are often much messier than the versions people debate in comment sections. Sometimes a man can deeply miss someone while still feeling emotionally incapable of returning fully. That contradiction creates grief no one really talks about. Because now he's trapped between longing and avoidance. wanting contact, fearing contact, missing her, avoiding the intensity her presence creates inside him. And eventually, even the silence itself starts feeling emotionally haunted. That's the best way I can describe it. Haunted, because her absence becomes oddly present. He sees something during the day and immediately imagines telling her about it, then remembers he can't naturally do that anymore. Or technically he could. But now the emotional distance makes everything feel complicated. Even sending a simple message feels loaded now. So instead he says nothing. Again. And silence slowly becomes its own form of grief. There's this specific masculine loneliness that happens when a man realizes he emotionally isolated himself from someone who actually made him feel understood. Not admired, not desired, understood. That realization arrives late sometimes. Painfully late. Usually after the emotional noise settles enough for him to finally hear what the connection actually meant to him underneath all the panic. That's when the memories change too. At first he replayed the emotionally intense moments, the deep conversations, the vulnerable nights, the moments where he felt exposed. But later, it's the soft moments that hurt most, the painfully normal ones. Her sitting quietly beside him while he worked, the way she said his name absent-mindedly, that tiny smile she made when he remembered small details about her. Ordinary intimacy becomes devastating in hindsight, because now he understands what those moments actually were. Safety. And emotionally avoidant people often don't recognize safety until after they lose access to it. That realization creates another layer of grief. Regret. Not always dramatic regret. Sometimes just this low, constant ache of knowing he mishandled something meaningful because he didn't know how to stay emotionally regulated inside it. And regret behaves strangely in men who struggle with emotional expression. Instead of openly grieving, they often become quieter, more withdrawn, more restless internally. Sometimes he starts driving at night for no real reason. Long routes, no destination, just movement. Like his body is searching for emotional release his mind still cannot articulate properly. And during those drives, that's when honesty starts slipping through the cracks. Little thoughts he avoids during the day suddenly become unavoidable. I miss her. I handled this badly. She really did care about me. Then why did I pull away? That last question destroys him sometimes. Because now the emotional fog is clearing slightly and he can finally see the contradiction more clearly. He wanted closeness. He got closeness. Then he panicked because the closeness mattered. Which sounds almost absurd once the nervous system calms down enough to see it clearly. But emotional fear rarely looks rational while you're inside it. That's why hindsight becomes so painful. Because now he sees moments differently. Moments where she tried to understand him. Moments where she reached for reassurance gently. Moments where she gave him emotional openings to be honest. And he remembers avoiding them. Deflecting. Shutting down. Changing the subject. Acting emotionally tired instead of emotionally afraid. That awareness hurts deeply when someone finally stops distracting themselves long enough to feel it. Especially because emotionally avoidant men often do love privately. That's another uncomfortable truth. They may not express consistently, may not communicate well, may not know how to stay emotionally available under pressure. But internally, some of them feel things intensely, painfully intensely. They just experience vulnerability as emotional exposure instead of connection. So now he's grieving someone while simultaneously knowing he participated in creating the distance himself. That creates a very specific type of sadness. Not clean victimhood. Responsibility mixed with longing. And honestly, that's harder to sit with. There's one image that keeps coming back to me. He's lying in bed late at night. Phone brightness low. Scrolling through old photos he already memorized emotionally weeks ago. Stopping at one picture longer than the others. Not because it's romantic. Because she looked relaxed, comfortable beside him. Like she trusted him emotionally. And suddenly, instead of missing only her, he misses the version of himself he was becoming around her too. Softer, more open, more emotionally alive. That realization breaks something quietly inside a lot of men. Because now the grief isn't only about losing her presence. It's about realizing the connection exposed needs, tenderness, and emotional depth he spent years pretending he didn't have. And once those parts wake up, silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels lonely. Nobody really talks about the conversations happening inside him during all of this. Not the external conversations, the internal ones. The exhausting, repetitive, emotionally messy arguments happening quietly in his head while outwardly he's acting fine. Because emotionally avoidant men often look calm long after they've stopped feeling calm internally. That's part of the confusion. People think silence means certainty. Sometimes silence is just emotional gridlock. A man sitting alone with feelings he doesn't fully know how to process without feeling weak, exposed, needy, guilty, overwhelmed. Sometimes all at once. And the strange thing is, a lot of these inner conversations sound embarrassingly human. Not profound. Not spiritual. Not poetic. Just conflicted. Like someone trying to negotiate with their own heart while losing the argument slowly. Usually it starts late at night. That seems to be when emotional honesty becomes hardest to escape. The distractions are gone. The noise settles. The nervous system has fewer places to hide. And suddenly the thoughts he spent all day out running start circling back. He picks up the phone, puts it down, and locks it again. Opens the conversation thread, scrolls upward, stops at old messages longer than he should, and internally the dialogue begins again. Just text her. No. Why? Because this is already messy. It's messy because you disappeared. I know. Then fix it. What if I can't? That helplessness sits heavily in people who are taught emotional control matters more than emotional honesty. Because now he's trapped between two unbearable feelings. The pain of reaching out, and the pain of staying silent. And sometimes silence wins simply because it feels less immediately vulnerable. That's the thing about avoidance. It prioritizes short-term emotional protection over long-term emotional peace. So instead of sending the message, he imagines sending it over and over. Entire conversations happen inside his head that never occur in reality. I miss you. You disappeared. I know. Then why did you do it? Because I didn't know how to stay close without panicking. That last sentence usually remains unspoken. Not because it isn't true, because saying it out loud feels humiliating somehow. Especially for men who built their identity around being emotionally composed. There's something deeply destabilizing about realizing another person affects you emotionally beyond your own control. It makes him feel exposed to himself. That's why even tiny moments start carrying emotional weight internally. Like hearing a phrase she used to say casually, or reaching for his phone after seeing something funny and realizing his instinct is still to send it to her. Those moments create these tiny emotional collapses throughout the day. Not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but internally, they accumulate, and eventually the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because he keeps trying to act attached externally while emotionally revolving around the connection privately. That split exhausts him. One part of him says, "You need to move on." Another part quietly responds, then why does everything still remind me of her? And honestly, sometimes he gets angry at himself for not being able to emotionally shut it off. That frustration matters. People imagine longing as soft and romantic. Sometimes longing feels irritating, disruptive, embarrassing, especially when he believes he should be over it already. So now even his grief becomes something he tries to suppress, which only makes it louder internally. There's this moment that happens sometimes when he's alone driving. No music, just road noise and his own thoughts finally catching up to him. And the honesty starts leaking through in fragments. She actually cared about me. Then why did I pull away? Because it got too intense. So what? That's not an excuse. I know. Then why didn't you just tell her that? Because I didn't fully understand it myself while it was happening. That's the part people struggle believing. But emotional overwhelm often becomes clear only in hindsight. While inside it, everything just feels confusing. Pressure, warmth, fear, attachment, relief, guilt, all tangled together. And because emotionally avoidant people tend to intellectualize feelings instead of sitting inside them honestly, they often react behaviorally before they understand themselves emotionally. That's why his explanation sounded incomplete, because internally he was incomplete too, still trying to understand why closeness felt both beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. There is another internal conversation that happens after enough time passes. This one hurts more, because now regret enters clearly. Not just longing, regret. Specific regret. He remembers exact moments where she emotionally reached toward him and he pulled away instead. Moments he minimized at the time because vulnerability made him uncomfortable. Now those moments replay differently. The softness in her voice, the patience she had with him, the subtle sadness that started appearing when his inconsistency grew. And suddenly the emotional reality becomes impossible to fully avoid anymore. She knew I was distancing myself. Yes. And she still tried. Yes. Why didn't I just tell her the truth? Because the truth felt dangerous. That's usually the answer underneath everything. Not dangerous physically. Emotionally. The truth would have required admitting, "You matter to me enough to affect me deeply." And once he says that out loud, he loses the illusion of emotional self-sufficiency completely. Some men would rather silently suffer than openly admit dependence. That sounds dramatic, but you can see it in the behavior constantly. Missing someone intensely while refusing to call. Watching their stories while pretending indifference. Typing emotional messages, then deleting them. There's one especially painful part of this internal experience nobody talks about enough. The fear that it's already too late. Because avoidance silence stretches time strangely. Days become weeks. Weeks become emotional distance. And now, reconnecting feels terrifying because he imagines the hurt she's carrying already. So, the inner dialogue changes again. She probably hates me. Maybe. She deserves better than this. She deserved honesty. I know. Then why are you still silent? Because shame freezes people sometimes. Especially when they know they hurt someone they genuinely cared about. That's the irony underneath avoidant behavior. A lot of these men are not emotionally unaffected. They're emotionally overwhelmed and emotionally unequipped at the same time, which creates this awful split internally. One voice says, "Reach for her." Another says, "You only hurt her again." One says, "You love her." Another says, "Then why couldn't you stay emotionally present?" And there's rarely a clean answer, just layers. Fear layered over attachment, shame layered over longing, distance layered over emotional dependence. Human beings are contradictory creatures, especially wounded ones. There's this image I keep thinking about. He's sitting on the edge of his bed at night, phone in his hand, reading the same old message again. One she probably forgot sending months ago. Something simple, supportive, gentle. And suddenly, he feels grief not only for losing her, but for how emotionally defended he was while she was still there trying to love him openly. That realization arrives quietly, not dramatically. Just this slow understanding that the connection wasn't the enemy. The vulnerability was. And now, the vulnerability exists anyway. Except she's no longer beside him while he feels it. That's what makes regret so cruel. Clarity often arrives after distance does. And once that clarity settles in, the internal conversations become less defensive and more honest. More tired too. Because eventually even avoidance gets exhausted. Eventually, he gets tired of pretending silence feels better than connection. Tired of acting emotionally detached while privately carrying her everywhere internally. Tired of replaying unfinished conversations that never got spoken out loud. And somewhere underneath all the mental noise, all the rationalizations, all the fear, all the emotional self-protection, is usually one painfully simple truth he avoids saying directly even to himself. He didn't want to need her this much. But he did. I think this is the part that hurts women the most. Not the silence. Not even the distance. The meaning they attach to it. Because when someone pulls away emotionally, the mind immediately starts searching for explanations. And most people eventually land on the same painful conclusion. If I had been enough, he would have stayed. That thought destroys people quietly. Especially when the connection felt emotionally genuine before everything changed. Because now she starts replaying herself instead of replaying him. Maybe she was too emotional, too available, too intense, too loving, too patient, not attractive enough, not detached enough, not healed enough. And meanwhile, half the time he was pulling away because the connection affected him too deeply, not too little. That's the tragic misunderstanding underneath so many of these dynamics. People assume withdrawal always means lack of feeling. Sometimes withdrawal happens because the feelings became impossible to emotionally control. Now, obviously, that does not magically excuse hurting someone. Impact still matters. Confusion still hurts. Inconsistency still damages trust. But emotionally speaking, many women completely misunderstand what was actually happening inside him. Because from the outside his behavior looks emotionally detached. Meanwhile, internally, he may have been unraveling quietly. There's this strange thing that happens when a man who spent years emotionally self-contained suddenly meets someone who makes him feel emotionally seen. Not admired, not desired. Seen. Those are very different experiences. Desire can stay surface level. Being emotionally seen reaches underneath the performance, underneath the charm, underneath the masculine composure, underneath the version of himself he carefully manages round the world. And once someone reaches that deeper layer, the connection stops feeling casual. That's when fear enters. Not because she lacks value, because she has enough emotional significance to destabilize him. And unfortunately, many emotionally avoidant men experience deep attachment as a threat to their internal stability instead of a source of safety. That's why some of them start acting colder precisely when they care more, which feels unbelievably cruel on the receiving end because the behavior and the emotion no longer match. She thinks he stopped caring. Meanwhile, internally, he may be thinking, I care too much, and I don't know how to regulate this. But he rarely says that. Sometimes because he lacks the language. Sometimes because admitting emotional dependency feels humiliating to him, especially men who build their identity around independence. There's one detail people overlook constantly. Emotionally avoidant men often feel safest when they are desired, but not emotionally dependent. That distance gives them a sense of control. But once emotional attachment becomes mutual and real, control disappears. Now her mood affects him. Now her absence affects him. Now one emotionally distant interaction can ruin his entire night unexpectedly. And that level of emotional impact terrifies people who learn survival through emotional self-protection. So he starts trying to reduce the intensity, not because she lacks worth, because she has too much emotional influence over him already. That's why this dynamic becomes so psychologically confusing for women, because his behavior unintentionally communicates, "You are too much," when internally the emotional reality is often closer to, "This affects me more deeply than I know how to handle." Those are completely different meanings, but externally, they can look identical. And unfortunately, humans interpret behavior more than hidden emotion. So she slowly starts internalizing his withdrawal as a reflection of her value. That's the heartbreaking part. Because many women become deeply insecure after emotionally avoidant relationships. Not necessarily because the man insulted them directly, because inconsistency creates self-doubt naturally. The warmth disappears. The emotional certainty disappears. The closeness becomes unstable. And the mind starts asking, "What changed about me?" Sometimes nothing changed about her. The connection simply became emotionally real enough to activate fear inside him. There's this moment I keep thinking about. She's lying awake at night rereading old conversations, trying to locate the exact point where everything shifted. Looking for clues. Analyzing tone changes. Searching for the moment she became too much. Meanwhile, somewhere else, he's doing something strangely similar. Not analyzing her flaws. Analyzing his own reactions. Trying to understand why someone loving him gently created so much internal panic. That's the irony. She thinks she overwhelmed him by being emotionally expressive. Meanwhile, he may have been overwhelmed by how safe, patient, and emotionally genuine the connection felt. Because emotionally safe love sounds beautiful in theory, but in reality, it exposes every emotional defense you built to survive without it. That exposure feels unbearable for some people at first, especially if emotional closeness historically came with pain, pressure, shame, or abandonment. So now, even healthy intimacy starts triggering survival responses. Withdrawal, numbing, distancing, confusion, and from the outside, it looks personal. That's what makes this so devastating. Because emotionally, it feels personal to both people. She feels rejected. He feels emotionally invaded by feelings he cannot regulate properly. Neither one fully understands the other in real time. There's another painful truth nobody talks about enough. Sometimes, emotionally avoidant men genuinely believe they are protecting the woman by pulling away. Not successfully, not maturely, but psychologically, some part of them thinks, if I can't fully show up consistently, maybe distance is kinder. The problem is, they often create the exact pain they were trying to avoid causing. Because unexplained withdrawal creates emotional confusion that lingers much longer than honest vulnerability would have. Still, underneath the avoidance is often shame rather than indifference. Shame that he cannot emotionally sustain the closeness he secretly craves. Shame that someone loving him gently activated fear instead of ease. Shame that he became emotionally inconsistent with someone who deserves stability. And shame makes people hide, especially men. That's why he may disappear emotionally while privately carrying enormous emotional weight. The outside and inside stop matching completely. He posts normal things, works normally, laughs normally. Meanwhile, internally, he's replaying one sentence she said weeks ago because it made him feel emotionally exposed in a way he still cannot explain. You don't always have to handle everything alone. That kind of sentence destroys emotionally guarded men quietly, because part of them desperately wants to believe it. Another part immediately distrusts the vulnerability underneath it. That internal split becomes exhausting. And eventually, he starts associating the connection itself with emotional instability. Not because she created instability intentionally, because the relationship exposed instability that already existed inside him. That distinction matters, especially for women who spend years believing, if I had loved differently, maybe he would have stayed emotionally present. Sometimes no amount of love can compensate for someone's inability to tolerate vulnerability consistently. Love can invite growth. It cannot force emotional capacity. And honestly, that realization hurts both people differently. She grieves the loss of connection. He grieves the fact that something good exposed emotional limitations he didn't want to confront about himself. That's why some avoidant men become deeply reflective only after distance. Once the emotional intensity settles slightly, clarity begins arriving in fragments. Now, he can finally admit things he resisted earlier. She really did care about me. She wasn't asking for too much. I felt safe with her. Then why did I keep pulling away? Because safety and vulnerability are not the same thing emotionally. Sometimes being emotionally safe with someone creates more fear, not less. Because now there's finally something meaningful enough to lose. And once that emotional reality settles into the body, avoidance stops feeling empowering. It starts feeling lonely. That's when another painful truth emerges quietly inside him. She wasn't hard to love. She was hard to emotionally hide from. And those are not the same thing at all. I think this is the hardest part to talk about honestly. Because people want endings. Clear ones. They want to know. Does he come back? Does he realize what he lost? Does the connection survive? Does love fix him eventually? And real life almost never answers these questions cleanly. Sometimes he comes back. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he returns emotionally softer, more self-aware, finally able to admit with the connection exposed inside him. And sometimes he stays trapped inside the same emotional patterns for years, missing her, thinking about her, comparing everyone to her quietly, while still lacking the emotional capacity to love consistently. That's the part people don't want to hear. Because longing and readiness are not the same thing. A man can deeply love someone and still not know how to stay emotionally present inside that love. Human beings romanticize realization too much, as if awareness automatically transforms behavior. It doesn't. Sometimes realization simply creates grief. There's usually a phase after enough distance where the emotional fog clears slightly. The panic settles. The defensiveness weakens. The nervous system stops reacting so intensely. And in that quieter space, clarity finally starts arriving. Not dramatic spiritual clarity, just painfully human clarity. The kind that shows up while folding laundry, driving home alone, standing in the grocery store staring blankly at something that reminds him of her unexpectedly. And suddenly he understands things differently now. Why her silence eventually changed. Why her warmth slowly became more cautious. Why she stopped emotionally reaching for him the same way. Because now he can finally see what his inconsistency actually felt like from her side. That realization hurts. Especially for men who genuinely loved privately while behaving avoidantly externally. Because now he sees the contradiction clearly. He wanted intimacy, but resisted vulnerability. Wanted closeness, but punished emotional dependence, wanted her presence, but kept emotionally disappearing whenever the connection became too real. And eventually, most people get tired of loving someone they have to emotionally chase constantly. That truth lands heavily once he's emotionally honest enough to admit it. There's this image that keeps coming into my mind. He's sitting in his car after months of silence. Phone in his hand again. Her contact still there. Still familiar. Still emotionally loaded somehow. And internally the dialogue sounds quieter now. Less defensive. More tired. You should have handled this differently. I know. She loved you. I know. Then why did you make it so hard for her to feel loved back? That silence after the question matters. Because sometimes there isn't a satisfying answer. Just emotional immaturity. Fear. Avoidance. Shame. Unresolved wounds. Human things. Not mystical things. Human beings break good connections every day because they don't know how to remain emotionally open without feeling unsafe. That doesn't make them monsters, but it does create consequences. And eventually reality arrives no matter how much avoidance delayed it. Sometimes the reality is, she moved on. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just quietly. Her energy changed. Her nervous system finally got tired. The hope slowly burned out. And weirdly, that's often when the full emotional impact finally hits him. Not because men only care once they lose someone. It's more complicated than that. Sometimes distance gave him enough emotional space to finally feel what he was suppressing all along. But now she's no longer emotionally waiting there while he figures himself out. That timing destroys people quietly, because emotional realization arriving late feels unbearable, especially when he starts noticing the permanence of her absence in ordinary moments. Nobody talks enough about how grief becomes mundane eventually. It's not always dramatic crying. Sometimes it's reaching for the phone before remembering there's nobody to text anymore, or hearing good news and instinctively wanting to tell her first, or sitting in traffic remembering the exact way she used to rest her hand near the center console while talking. Tiny things become devastating once someone is gone emotionally. And if he does come back, it usually doesn't happen the way people imagine. Not cinematic, not perfectly confident, not with some enlightened speech about destiny and transformation. Usually it's awkward, humanly awkward, a message typed and deleted 15 times first. A casual hey hiding months of emotional chaos underneath it. A voice slightly shakier than normal during the first phone call. Because emotionally avoidant men often feel deeply exposed once they finally stop running. Now, there's no emotional distance protecting them anymore. Now, they have to face the hurt they created, the inconsistency, the silence, the confusion, and honestly, some men cannot tolerate that level of accountability emotionally, so they never fully return. Not because the connection meant nothing, because facing the emotional consequences of their avoidance feels overwhelming too. That's another painful truth. Avoidant people often fear shame as much as vulnerability. So even after realizing they love her, they may still hesitate to reconnect because now they must confront the possibility that they hurt someone irreversibly. And sometimes they did. That's important too. Not every connection survives emotional inconsistency. Not every woman remains emotionally open forever. People have limits, even deeply loving people. There's this fantasy online that profound emotional connections automatically overcome everything. But love does not replace emotional readiness. It doesn't automatically create communication skills, emotional regulation, consistency, self-awareness. Love can expose wounds beautifully, but exposure alone is not healing. Some men return because the pain finally forced them into honesty. Others stay emotionally fragmented, missing her while repeating the same avoidance patterns with someone new. Trying again, pulling away again, feeling trapped again. Because until someone confronts the fear underneath their avoidance, the pattern usually follows them. Different face, same emotional panic. That's why this story doesn't really have a perfectly comforting ending. Some people reconnect and build something healthier. Some reconnect briefly and realize the damage changed things too much. Some never speak again, but carry each other emotionally for years. And some relationships become permanent emotional ghosts. Not because they were perfect, because they revealed something emotionally life-changing in both people. There's one final internal dialogue I keep hearing in my head. It's quieter than the others, less reactive, more honest. She deserved consistency. Yes. And I loved her. Yes. Then why couldn't I just stay? Because loving someone and knowing how to receive love properly are different skills. That realization changes everything once it finally sinks in. Because people assume love is the hard part. Sometimes love happens naturally, staying emotionally open long enough to sustain it. That's the hard part, especially for people who learn emotional self-protection before they ever learned emotional intimacy. And maybe that's the saddest thing underneath all of this. Not that he didn't feel enough. Sometimes he felt too much, too fast, too deeply, too unprepared. And instead of moving closer to the connection, he kept trying to escape the vulnerability of being changed by it. Until eventually he looked around one day and realized the person he was trying so hard not to need had quietly become impossible to forget.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.